Good morning, fellow babies. A great day in store for you here in the metro area.
But the senator, while insisting he was not intoxicated, could not explain his nudity.
For hundreds of years, people from all walks of life have reported sightings of a large hairy animal walking on 2 feet. The scientific community has dismissed these sightings as hoaxes, hallucinations, or misidentified bears. But is there another option? Is it possible that there is an ape, the largest of the great apes, unrecognized and unclassified by modern science, roaming the forest of North America? Please join us as we seek the answer to this compelling question. You have arrived at the intersection of myth and science, of fact and folklore. You have arrived at Bigfoot Crossing.
Hey, fellow babies, welcome. Hey, fellow babies, thank you, and welcome to Bigfoot Crossing, the intersection of myth and science, of fact and folklore. I'm Michael Willey. I am your guide on this ongoing expedition. This episode of Bigfoot Crossing is brought to you by Be-Eco Fuel Tabs. Be-Eco Fuel Tabs will increase your car's gas mileage, reduce emissions, and improve your car's power and performance. Be-Eco Fuel Tabs is the remedy for the pain at the pump that we are all feeling, fellow babies. For more information, go to www.gas48.com/pain at the pump. That's www.gas, the numbers 48.com/pain at the pump. Be-Eco Fuel Tabs. Put your car on the pill. Now, in our previous episode, fellow babies, in our premiere episode, we came up with a good composite description of Bigfoot based upon eyewitness reports. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, that's a very basic, maybe even an elementary episode, well, that's the point. As we discussed last time, this is not a podcast just for believers. You know, skeptics only know what the media tell them about Bigfoot. They don't go off reading Bigfoot books. They don't go to Bigfoot websites. In large, unless you invite them, they're not going to listen to Bigfoot podcasts. So if you have a friend or a neighbor or a relative, maybe your wife, who's a skeptic, invite them to listen to these podcast episodes. So what I'm trying to do here is to give a good foundation of background information on the history of Bigfoot, on the history of the search for Bigfoot for skeptics, but also for a lot of Bigfoot believers who may not have that good background also. So be sure to invite your friends and your neighbors and your fellow Bigfoot believers to listen to these podcast episodes. Now, if you missed our premiere episode of Bigfoot Crossing, well, I must say I am disappointed. Don't worry, though. I will not embarrass anyone by calling you out by name, Carl. But you can redeem yourself by listening to missed episodes at www.anchor.fm/Bigfoot-Crossing. That's the website where the Bigfoot Crossing podcast is hosted. You can also go to the Bigfoot Crossing YouTube channel at bit.ly/Bigfoot-Crossing. Now, there are links to both of those websites on the Bigfoot Crossing website at www.bigfootcrossing.net. And while you're there on the website, be sure to visit the Bigfoot Crossing web store.
Shameless plug. Sorry.
Anyway, now in this episode, we are going to play a game called Name That Critter. We're going to try to name and classify Bigfoot. We're going to try to figure out just what kind of critter Bigfoot is. So, class is in session. Now, there are a handful, 5 to be exact, of possible classifications for Bigfoot. 1, legend. 2, hoax. 3, hallucination. 4, misidentified bears. And 5, a real, honest-to-goodness, living, breathing creature. Now let's start with legend first. Is Bigfoot simply a legend or a myth? Now, Native American and First Nation peoples certainly have stories about Sasquatch that go back generation, and these stories are shrouded in the mist of time. Some of these stories ascribe legendary attributes to Bigfoot and have taken on legendary status. But, as John Green has said in his wonderful book, Sasquatch the Apes Among Us, if Bigfoot is just simply a legend, well, it's really odd that so many people can see one. And Mr. Green is right. You generally cannot see a legend or a myth. Every year people report, though, hundreds of Bigfoot sightings. And as we learned in our last episode, not every sighting is a person in an ape suit or a ghillie suit. And don't forget that 2 of our eyewitness reports in the last episode came from law enforcement officers, folks who are trained observers. People are seeing something, and they're not seeing a legend. They're not seeing a myth. And so that begs the question of how Bigfoot wound up in the same classification as unicorns, leprechauns, and mermaids. Well, I blame ethnography and intellectual laziness. Now, what is ethnography, you ask breathlessly? Ethnography is a branch of anthropology that involves the studying and recording of cultures. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, anthropologists and ethnographers descended upon the native tribes in North America and began to study and record their cultures. When members of those native tribes began telling the ethnographers stories of a tribe of hairy giants that lived in the mountains and forests, well, the ethnographers had no point of reference for such an animal, so they classified those stories as legend. And you have to remember, there were no mounds of evidence, there were no Bigfoot organizations, no database of sightings back then. So one can understand why ethnographers would write off these stories, these accounts, as legend. But what I cannot understand and cannot abide is the intellectual laziness of the vast majority of the scientific community today that ignores the mounds of evidence that does exist and continues to label Sasquatch as a legend and a cultural phenomenon. Dr. Jeff Meldrum is a professor of anthropology at Idaho State University. He is the leading academic involved in the hunt for Bigfoot and hopefully a future guest on this podcast.
Paging Dr. Meldrum. Paging Dr. Meldrum. You are wanted on Bigfoot Crossing.
Anyway, Dr. Meldrum tells of a colleague who, in reference to Bigfoot, stated, quote, "After all, these are just stories," end quote. Now that, fellow babies, is a textbook example of intellectual laziness. That colleague of Jeff Meldrum's was basically saying, I don't have to carry my lazy carcass out into the woods to do any actual work. These are just stories. And I love Dr. Meldrum's response. Quote, "Stories that apparently leave tracks, shed hair, void scat, vocalize are observed and described by reliable, experienced witnesses. Hardly just stories," end quote. Indeed, hardly just stories. Think about this, fellow babies. Even if the scientific community was able to explain away 99% of the tracks and the hair and scat samples and the vocalizations and the sightings, that still leaves 1% that science cannot explain and that therefore science should investigate. It's time to remove Bigfoot from the same category as unicorns and leprechauns and mermaids. Bigfoot is not just a legend or a mythical beast. Now let's move on to the next potential classification, hoax. Now many assert that Bigfoot Sasquatch sightings are merely the product of cunning hoaxers. Are some of those sightings the result of hoaxes? A person in an ape suit or a ghillie suit? Undoubtedly. However, Bigfoot sightings have been reported for decades in nearly every state of the Union and in nearly every province of Canada. Sightings have been reported by a broad spectrum of humanity, ranging from housewives to law enforcement officers to experienced seasoned hunters, loggers, and other outdoorsmen. It is highly unlikely that all of those sightings are the result of an elaborate international hoax. In addition to the actual sightings, there is a wealth of physical evidence that points to the existence of Sasquatch in North America. For example, literally thousands of footprint casts have been collected over the years. Could some of those footprints have been faked? Certainly. Are all of those footprints fake? Highly unlikely. Why is that? Because of the presence of dermal ridges. Now, what are dermal ridges? Fingerprints are an example of dermal ridges. All primates have dermal ridges on their hands and on the bottoms of their feet. And many of the plaster casts of Bigfoot footprints reveal dermal ridges on the bottom of the foot. And further, many of those plaster casts reveal movement in the toes and the foot from stride to stride. Both dermal ridges and toe movement are difficult, if not impossible, to fake. We believe the following quote to be an accurate appraisal of the possibility that all Bigfoot evidence in existence is the result of a hoax. Quote, either the most complex and sophisticated hoax in the history of anthropology has continued for centuries without being exposed, or the most man-like and largest non-human primate on Earth has managed to survive in parts of North America and remains undiscovered by modern science. End quote. And that's from George W. Gill, anthropologist and professor emeritus at the University of Wyoming. If you're still thinking, this is all a hoax, consider this, quote, but let us look at what would be entailed in explaining all Sasquatch reports as hoaxes. Published Sasquatch reports in North America date from the 1840s and continue up to the present. They have come from the West Coast, extending from California to Alaska, but also from most states and provinces in central, eastern, and southern North America. Sasquatch trails, a trail is a series or line of tracks, have been followed for several miles in snow. Trails in soil show the characteristic huge footprints, long strides, and impressions sufficiently deep to indicate great weight. Explaining the tracks and trails with a human hoaxer requires the involvement of tall, powerful athletes able to maintain yard-and-a-half long steps up steep embankments carrying over 200 pounds while wearing false feet capable of flexing from step to step. Explaining the activities attributed to Sasquatches requires athletes able and willing to throw logs and stumps with ease and to spend interminable lengths of time on remote islands waiting for clam diggers or other humans to chance by. These athletes must also camp out undetected in remote mountainous areas, ready to scream and bellow for prolonged periods when a logging operation starts up. To explain the consistencies of Sasquatch appearance, anatomy, gait, vocalization, and behavior discussed in this book requires truly enviable levels of dedication, scholarship, motivation, and organization, with an equally impressive level of funding, end quote. And that quote comes from the marvelous book, North America's Great Ape, the Sasquatch by John Bindernagel. John Bindernagel has passed but was a Canadian wildlife biologist. And Dr. Bindernagel was the very first guest on the very first episode of the radio version of Bigfoot Crossing. And that episode is archived at the Bigfoot Crossing YouTube channel at bit.ly/Bigfoot-Crossing. Now, Dr. Bindernagel's wonderful book is in my personal library, and while I believe it is out of print, copies can be found on Amazon sometimes. Now, here's one more thing to consider. As Dr. Bindernagel stated, published Bigfoot reports date from the 1840s, but Native American and First People accounts go back much further. If every Sasquatch account is the result of a hoax, who was hoaxing the Native American and First Nation tribes before the white man ever set foot on this continent? One must either believe that every sighting, every footprint, every recorded vocalization, every sample of hair and scat, in short, every shred of evidence, is the product of an elaborate, international, century-spanning hoax, or one must believe that the largest of the great apes is walking the forests of North America, unrecognized and uncollected by modern science. A much greater leap of faith is required to believe the former than the latter. Have there been Bigfoot hoaxes? Absolutely. Will there continue to be Bigfoot hoaxes? Unfortunately, yes. Some people want their 15 minutes of fame, even if they have to be dishonest about it. But is every Bigfoot report the result of a hoax? Absolutely not. The argument that every Bigfoot report is a hoax is the epitome of intellectual laziness and cannot stand up to scrutiny. People are experiencing something that science has not accounted for. Now let's move on to the next classification. Hallucinations. Now when I use the word hallucination, I'm not using it in its medical context. I'm using it in the ordinary, everyday context. For example, if I tell a friend, "Hey, I saw Bigfoot while I was out hiking," and my friend says to me, "You were just seeing things," or "Your eyes were playing tricks on you," or even better, "And what were you drinking at the time?"
Cheers!
I'm using, or maybe misusing, the word hallucination in the context of a perfectly normal and natural phenomenon that everyone has experienced: pareidolia. That word comes from a Greek word meaning resembling an image. Have you ever looked up in the clouds and seen a bunny rabbit or some other familiar image? That's pareidolia. Is it possible that some Sasquatch sightings, especially quick or fleeting ones, are the result of pareidolia? Certainly. Let me give you an example. I was driving down a back road one fall evening, and that road paralleled the railroad track. In the green space between the railroad track and the road, there were utility poles. And as I was driving along, I saw what looked like a creature of some sort standing beside one of the utility poles. So I turned the car around and went back for a second look. And upon closer inspection, what I thought might have been a Bigfoot standing by that utility pole was indeed black garbage bags full of leaves that someone had stacked up there. Pareidolia. So is it possible that all Sasquatch sightings are the result of pareidolia? Absolutely not. Pareidolia doesn't leave tracks or scat. Pareidolia doesn't steal fish from nets, pick up roadkill, dig for clams, throw rocks, or shake travel trailers, just to name a few behaviors associated with Bigfoot encounters. To attribute all Sasquatch sightings to pareidolia or to witnesses' eyes playing tricks on them is to ignore the vast amount of other evidence in existence. People are seeing and reporting something. An animal not classified or recognized by modern science. The next classification we will look at is misidentified bears. Now, bears, of course, are the largest predator in North America that's recognized by modern science. And bears, in all likelihood, share territory with Sasquatches and may compete with them for food and other resources. Is it possible that some Bigfoot sightings are the result of folks misidentifying a bear? "I suppose so," he said reluctantly. However, there are striking differences between bears and Sasquatches. And I have posted on our website a couple of images for your review. There's a picture of a bear standing on its hind legs and a picture of a bear sitting, kind of like a human. And I've also posted silhouettes of a bear and a Bigfoot for comparison purposes. Go to www.bigfootcrossing.net and click on episode info, and then click on episode 2 to view those images. And while you're on the website, be sure to visit the Bigfoot Crossing web store.
Shameless plug.
Anyway, let's get back to those pivotal distinctions. Bears are easily recognizable due to their long muzzle and ears on top of their head. Bears are also habitually quadrupedal and only stand on their hind legs in a few instances, such as dominance and aggression displays, reaching for food and scratching their back and such. When a bear walks on its hind feet, it utilizes a shuffling gait that is clearly not the bear's most comfortable form of locomotion, and is very distinct from the long, smooth stride of the habitually bipedal Bigfoot. Then look at the narrow, sloping shoulders and the short front legs of the bear, as compared with the broad shoulders and the long arms of the Sasquatch. Finally, the short hind legs and the low crotch of the bear is a dead giveaway when compared to the long legs and the high crotch of a Bigfoot. More than once, a Bigfoot report has included the statement that the Bigfoot stepped over a fence without breaking stride. It is absolutely impossible to imagine a bear doing that while walking on its hind legs. I included the picture of the sitting bear because many reported Sasquatch sightings involve the creature just simply sitting on a rock or a stump, watching human activity. When I look at the picture of the bear sitting like a human would, I see a bear that is obviously sitting in an atypical fashion. That is a manner it's generally not accustomed to, because it's pretty apparent that bear has no idea what to do with his front paws. So I'll ask the question again. Is it possible that some Bigfoot sightings are the result of folks misidentifying a bear? Maybe. Depending on that person's age and their experience of being out in the woods, along with other factors such as lighting and weather conditions. But it is absolutely impossible for all Bigfoot sightings to be attributed to misidentified bears. Doing so ignores the fact that many sighting reports are made by hunters and fishermen and loggers and other folks who are accustomed to being in the great outdoors and are unlikely to confuse a bear with a Sasquatch. It also ignores the fact that many reports have been made by law enforcement officers and other trained observers. Again, folks who are unlikely to confuse a bear and a Sasquatch. So let's recap what we've learned. 1. Bigfoot is not a myth or legend because there are so many reported sightings. 2. We've learned that while there have been Sasquatch hoaxes, and undoubtedly they will continue, not all Bigfoot sightings can be attributed to hoaxes. 3. We have learned that while it is possible that some Bigfoot sightings are the result of what I unscientifically called hallucinations, but is really pareidolia, it is impossible for all sightings to be the result of pareidolia because of the other behavior associated with sightings. 4. Similarly, we have learned that while some sightings could be the result of misidentifying a bear, too many sightings have been made by law enforcement officers and experienced outdoorsmen for all sightings to be the result of misidentified bears. So that leaves our final classification, a real, honest-to-goodness, living, breathing creature that is unrecognized and unclassified by modern science. Hogwash, some of you are thinking. Some of you might be thinking something even more graphic. But hey, This is a family podcast, so watch your language.
I am so sorry.
Now let's think about this for a minute. Suppose it could be proven that a combination of hoaxes, pareidolia, and misidentified bears could account for 99% of Bigfoot sightings. That still leaves 1% of Bigfoot sightings that can only be classified as ding 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 ding, a real animal. But what kind of animal, he asked thoughtfully. Well, we won't know for sure just what kind of critter Sasquatch is until one is captured or killed. But, based upon the mounds of evidence that has been collected over the years, we can draw some conclusions. And that's exactly what we will do next time. Be sure to join us right here at Bigfoot Crossing for our next episode, Name That Critter Part 2. This episode of Bigfoot Crossing was brought to you by Be Eco Fuel Tabs. Be Eco Fuel Tabs, the remedy for your pain at the pump. Go to www.gas48.com/pain at the pump for more information. Bigfoot Crossing is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Anchor.fm/Bigfoot-Crossing, and the Bigfoot Crossing YouTube channel at bit.ly/Bigfoot-Crossing. Please subscribe on your preferred platform. And if you're looking for a gift for your favorite Bigfoot enthusiast, be sure to check out the BFC web store at bigfootcrossing.net.
Ooh, shameless plug.
All right, there's the bell. Thanks again for being with us here today at Bigfoot Crossing. Now get out of here.
We hope you have enjoyed your visit with us here at Bigfoot Crossing. The internet home for Bigfoot Crossing can be found at www.bigfootcrossing.net. Michael Willey's website, Bigfoot in Tennessee, can be found at www.tnbigfoot.net. Please follow us on Facebook at Bigfoot Tennessee. You can also follow Michael Willey on Twitter. His handle is at Michael B. Willey. Each episode of Bigfoot Crossing is posted to the Bigfoot Crossing YouTube channel. Please subscribe so you can be notified when new episodes are posted. Your feedback is always welcome. Please email questions and comments to tnsasquatch@gmail.com. Be sure to let us know which episode you have a question or comment about. Thanks for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you next time right here at Bigfoot Crossing.
This is Brock Whitmore, live on the scene. Sir, did you see what happened?
Yeah, did.